So I wanted to talk to you about the period after King David and Solomon. And this period after King David and Solomon, I like to refer to as the period of the divided kingdom. And it is this period that stretches from 1 Kings 12 to 2 Kings 25. So basically the rest of the books of 1 and 2 Kings after the account of Solomon in the first 11 chapters of 1 Kings. And this is kind of the analytic material, I guess what I would call the analytic material of 1 and 2 Kings, because it's not really an overarching narrative, but it's more like an annal of the books of Israel and Judah that covers 400 years. Now, it's not the official annals. It's not the royal annals. In fact, the royal annals are probably the sources for what the Deuteronomist is using for this material. And in fact, he'll talk about the different kings, and he'll briefly summarize their lifetimes, and he'll say, well, is it not written in the books of the annals of Judah, or the annals of the kings of Judah, or the annals of the kings of Israel? So he is using this material as source material. Intersprinkled in this is the wonderful narrative of Elijah and Elisha, sort of a cycle of narratives about these two great prophetic characters that are sort of interwoven. And so all of this material covers about 400 years of Israel's history after the reign of Solomon. So if Solomon's reign lasted 40 years, from 968 to 928, then this covers the period from 928 until the fall of the southern kingdom, the fall of Judah in 586. And it's the period of the divided kingdom. So you've got both the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom operating at the same time. Now, the Deuteronomist has a very heavy hand, again, in the writings of this story. God is clearly involved in terms of what the Deuteronomist and how the Deuteronomist views things. God is clearly involved with the stories of the kings of Israel and the kings of Judah. And again, it's his theology. Worship Yahweh alone and you're going to be okay. You don't engage in apostasy, you're going to be okay. You worship in the cult in Jerusalem, you're going to be okay. Well, that's great for the southern kings. The northern kings, well, they set up another cult. And so they were de facto almost sinful, right? And then listen to the prophets as God's messengers. And really, it's very analytic. You have about a chapter for each king. And some of the major kings get a little bit more story, but you get a chapter for each king. And the Deuteronomist will start out and he'll say a little bit about the king, and then a little bit about how long he reigned, and then he'll say this king was good in the eyes of the Lord, or he was evil in the eyes of the Lord, and he gives his prophetic judgment. And basically that judgment is based upon whether they focused and had exclusive worship of Yahweh, or whether they engaged in apostasy, according to Deuteronomist. How does this start? How does this split between the northern and southern kingdoms come about? Well, it comes about because of Solomon worshiping the wives of his foreign wives, the gods of his foreign wives, and not because he had the wives, but because he engaged in apostasy, and because of this, the kingdom is basically ripped away from him. The tribes of the north, and that's 10 of them, they basically orient themselves towards the north. And they split off, and Solomon and his successor, Rehoboam, his son, they only have the kingdom of Judah. So Judah is preserved, and in fact, really throughout the rest of 1 Kings and 2 Kings, it's still the Davidic monarchy. It's one family, the house of David. Okay. Jeroboam is the one who breaks away from Solomon, but he does evil in the eyes of the Deuteronomist, even though he's doing the bidding of Yahweh, because Yahweh has judged Solomon for worshiping these foreign wives. He does evil in the eyes of the Deuteronomist because he sets up shrines at the northern and southern ends of the kingdom in Bethel and Dan, in which Yahweh is enthroned on a golden calf. Well, it's like this worship, counter worship, right? And for the Deuteronomist, this counter temple, these counter temples are really, that's idolatry, right? Because you're supposed to go up to Jerusalem, worship Yahweh in Jerusalem alone, not anywhere else. But he sets up these shrines in Bethel and Dan. I've got a map here I can show you. Oh, it's not very large. But Bethel's down here, Dan's up here. So, let me get the pointer out. So Bethel's down here, and Dan is up here. So that's the northern edge of the kingdom. That's the northern kingdom here. Dan is the northern edge. There's a shrine there, and there's a shrine there. That means he doesn't want people to leave the kingdom to worship other gods, right? The Baals would have been worshipped up here, and Yahweh, of course, would have been worshipped in Jerusalem down here in Judah. So basically on the borders of the kingdom is where he sets up those shrines. So anyway, that's his sin. That's Jeroboam's sin. And so a lot of times when the Deuteronomist makes a proclamation for some of these later kings, well, he followed in the sin of Jeroboam and worshipped other gods, or he followed in the sin of Solomon and worshipped other gods. That's how, the judgment is, that he follows in the steps of his parents, his fathers. Generally, the northern kingdom is viewed negatively by the Deuteronomist. Because of the establishments of these high places, and because they continue to worship these other gods, they're viewed negatively. Eventually, they do establish a capital in the center in Samaria. But what's interesting about the northern kingdom is its instability. From the period of 928 to 842, there are 19 kings from 9 families, many who are killed during coups or in battle. So the northern kingdom is a very unstable kingdom. Some of the great, one great example of a northern kingdom who was quite evil was Ahab and his wife Jezebel. They're the great enemies of Elijah, right? He steals Naboth's garden, for example, who is one of his people in his kingdom, and he basically takes it away and is judged by Elijah for not killing the foreign king Ben-Hadad, for basically being corrupt and taking the property of his people in his kingdom, for pursuing Elijah because Elijah calls him out for worshiping other gods. And Elijah just basically says, you're going to die a violent death, and indeed he does. He dies and his blood is licked up by dogs. So not a great character, but he's a great character, really lovely. I mean, not lovely, but just a great narrative character. It's fun stuff to read. Ahab and Jezebel, but obviously an evil man. And for the Deuteronomist, he's the wicked example, right, of how bad things can get in the northern kingdom. And basically, the Deuteronomist almost always views the northern kingdoms negatively. The southern kingdom, like I mentioned, is one single dynasty. It's the Davidic kingdom. And of course, they're somewhat positive. The Deuteronomist judges many of them positively because of the royal ideology. And they, of course, continue to worship in Jerusalem. The high point there's basically 2 kings that are viewed as really positively by the Deuteronomist: Hezekiah and Josiah. Hezekiah, because of his association with Isaiah, and his use of Isaiah as kind of the prophet Isaiah as kind of his advisor, right? When he's battling against Assyria, and he returns to Yahweh, right? He returns and says, you know what, the problem is we can overcome them if we simply return to Yahweh. And then Josiah, who instigates a religious reform and rebuilding in the mid-7th century. And Jeremiah is a major prophet during Josiah. So the association, in part, because of Jeremiah with Josiah, or Isaiah with Hezekiah, makes them positive in the eyes of the Deuteronomists, because, again, the prophets, the big role of the prophets was to call Israel back to worshiping Yahweh. That was their big job, to exclusive worshiping Yahweh, to call Israel to that. Now, we do have this story of Elijah and Elisha, who are also prophets, in much of the end of 1 Kings and through the beginning of 2 Kings. So from 1 Kings 17 to 2 Kings 13. Wonderful, wonderful stories. These are the kinds of stories that we love to tell children in Sunday school or in children's church. Because of the story, like Elijah being taken up into the chariot, and Elisha standing there and watching his master taking up, and he gets the mantle that falls from heaven, and he touches the mantle, and the waters part for him, and he's able to cross the Jordan like the way his master had been able to do. Wonderful stuff. Wonderful stuff. Or the miracles of, making the axe head float, or taking poison from the stew. Both Elijah and Elisha heal sick, or Elisha restores a dead person to life. Elijah calling fire down from heaven. Great stories. And they're just tremendous fun to read and to engage. And I would encourage you to do these. Look at these. The big theme, and probably my favorite story, is Elijah's story of the theophany, where he's being pursued by his enemies, by Ahab and Jezebel, and they send out enemies to pursue him and to kill him, and he flees, and he almost wants to give up his life and give up completely, and he lies down, and he just wants to just give up entirely, and the Lord puts food next to his head, or an angel of the Lord puts food and gives him food for the journey and sends him on, and then he goes to the holy mountain of God, and the mountain shakes and quakes, and there's fire and there's storm, and God's not in that, but God's in the still small voice. It's a great story. Read 1 Kings 19 sometime. It's really about the restoration of faith when you're completely down. It's a great story. Or the story in 1 Kings 18 where he has a competition with the prophets of Baal, and he shames them by calling fire down upon his sacrifice, and they couldn't do that, right? So that's another great story that we tell children. These guys function more or less as kingmakers. Elijah is given the role of making the kings of Israel and Judah, and even over a foreign king of Aram. And Elisha, who is his successor, continues in that. And of course, we heard the story about Naboth's vineyard that is taken away by Ahab, and Elijah counters him. And again, so he stands up for social justice. So great stories in here. Good stuff. Take a look at some of these stories. A lot of these are precursors for how Jesus' story is told, the healings and some of the other things that you find in here. They're great stories, and I think they kind of give some relief, when you're reading through 1 Kings and 2 Kings. And I really wouldn't. I mean, if you have the time, sure. But this can be kind of repetitive, boring stuff. Oh, this king did this, and this king did that. And, but these Elijah and Elisha stories give a little pep to the narrative. And I think they allow the vehicle for the Deuteronomists to talk about, to still demonstrate the importance of, the prophetic importance of worshiping Yahweh and Yahweh alone, the exclusive worship of Yahweh, to illustrate that narratively throughout the story of these various kings that he's telling about. So great stuff, and I hope you'll enjoy skimming through these works and learning a little bit about these kings. You don't have to go too much into depth, but maybe check out 1 Kings 19, the story of Elijah's epiphany or theophany. Great story. Or the competition between Elijah and the prophets of Baal in 1 Kings 18. They're just a lot of fun. Okay? All right, well, thank you for listening, and I hope you got a little bit of an introduction to 1st and 2nd Kings.